Be prepared to be shocked, friends. Do you know that 2/3 of Americans report that they themselves are an addict or have a family member who has been addicted to drugs or alcohol? That's 2 out of 3 people. If you're in an elevator with just 2 other people, that means statistically, 2 out of the 3 of you have firsthand experience with addiction or someone you love does. If you want more about this stat, there's an article in US News and World Report from August of 2023 that goes more into this. But the takeaway for me is what I already know and believe. Addiction is out of control in America and is ruining lives daily. Thank you for joining me today on Living Beyond Limits, where we discuss how to overcome any limitation that you may be facing. I'm your host, Marcy Langlois. Addiction doesn't just affect the active addict, rather it affects everyone that loves them. For our purposes today, I'm going to use addict, but please know that that term can refer to using either drugs or alcohol. It's so painful to watch people that we love go down the road of addiction. Oftentimes, as we watch the events unfold for the active addict, it appears that things go from bad to worse, and you feel powerless to help. I know. I've been there both as the active addict and as someone who loved an active addict. Today, we're going to look at some of the most common myths about addiction to provide a greater sense of understanding about what addiction is and isn't, why people become addicted, and what the truth behind some of the myths are. Some of my earliest memories are of me drinking beer out of my dad's beer cans. I watched all the adult men in my life drink beer and make a ruckus. And honestly, it looked fun to me. My dad would have me fetching beers out of the fridge. So I'd open the can, I'd take a big old slug out of it, and then I'd hand him the beer. As often as I could get my hands on alcohol when I was younger, I drank it. I got drunk for the very first time at a wedding sometime before the age of 10. And then the frequency increased in middle school. By the time high school rolled around, all bets were off. With access to drugs and alcohol so easy, you won't be surprised to hear I was using or drinking something every single day. Early on in my addiction, it was fun, or at least I was thinking it was. I was on a mission to get completely wrecked every single time I used. I wasn't somebody who was looking to have a glass of wine or beer. I always wanted to have the entire case of whatever I was consuming. After sitting in thousands of recovery meetings, this seems to be a very common theme. Most people start drinking and trying drugs at a young age, and when they do, they almost always are looking to get completely annihilated. My addiction was fueled by the internal pain and turmoil from unresolved trauma and a dysfunctional family system. Alcohol and drugs provided the illusion that I was escaping my pain. No such luck. It only made things worse. I couldn't see that drinking and using drugs was damaging my life in their own separate and unique ways. No matter how obvious the signs were, no matter how many other things I had to deal with, addiction was by itself enough to ruin my life. But the fact remained that I desperately needed and wanted relief from all the ways that I felt like I wasn't enough, feeling I wasn't worthy of love, and then, of course, the memories of the lives lost in the car accident. I was totally in denial, though, and believed that drinking was working for me, that it was a bandage that allowed me to keep going despite the long list of things I was avoiding by using. So I kept doing the same thing day in and day out, and I kept getting the exact same results. Nothing changed. If you're someone that doesn't have a problem with drugs and alcohol, what I have just described may sound like absolute reckless behavior. And guess what? You're absolutely right. It is. It's just plain wrong to think that using any mind altering substance, which creates a whole host of other issues, is going to fix any situation in your life. But you see, that's the great lie of addiction and where the addict gets caught. People who are not addicted often have a tremendous amount of trouble trying to understand why. Why does the addict think there is relief in using? Because they can see the truth. They can see the damage that addiction itself does. Along with not understanding the way that the addict thinks, There are a whole bunch of other things that the average person simply doesn't understand about the addict's behavior. My intention today is to create some understanding to ease the pain for the loved ones and hopefully bring some understanding to the situation. Here are the most common myths of addiction that I've run across. One, the addict is drinking and using because they want to. This is one of my very favorite myths to bust because if people could only understand the torment of drinking out of necessity rather than because you actually enjoy it. Every single person that I have ever met in recovery, which is thousands at this point, say the exact same thing. Using stopped being fun years before I was ever able to actually even attempt quitting. Here's what a typical night of drinking would look like for me. I would drink as much as I could, as fast as I could, and then I would get angry, say mean and hurtful things to my partner or my daughter while I was completely out of my mind, and then the next morning, remember what I did. Awful. Oh my God. It was so terrible. It was completely and totally awful to wake up the next morning and have the first feeling be an incredible sense of shame for my behavior from the night before. I wanted to hide. I didn't want to have to face them because I had done it again. I had been out of line and hurtful. To make matters worse, I knew that I had a problem with using, but I couldn't stop. And I was in so much internal pain that I didn't want to stop, which made me feel even more shame. I couldn't find my way out of the quandary of the overwhelming painful feelings and the only tool that I thought was working. Because of the excessive shame I was feeling, I needed relief. And so within hours, I started using all over again. This is a shame cycle, and it is an endless, vicious cycle that takes any fun out of using that may have once been there. Number two, the addict doesn't love their family enough to stop using. I often hear this from the addict's partners, parents, or kids. They don't love me enough to stop. Let's be very clear here. The addict's using has nothing to do with how much they love other people. It is all about their own internal pain and shame. There's an assumption that the addict can just stop using because they love their family enough, and that should be a good enough reason to stop. Unfortunately, addiction is drenched in denial, and denial tells you that you aren't hurting anyone and that everything is going to be just fine for you to keep doing exactly what you're doing. No amount of love that the addict has for their family will be enough to stop them from drinking, unfortunately. In addition to denial, there's also a physiological dependency that has occurred now because the person has become dependent upon whatever substance they are using. So asking someone to stop cold turkey can also have a lot of unintended consequences. People die from stopping using, and that's the facts. Number three, the addict should be able to just stop using because they see the harm that they're causing. The only way that I know people stop using is when the pain of using becomes greater than the pain of not using. Let me say that again. People stop using when the pain of using becomes greater than the pain of not using. This is precisely why people change. There has to be a pain point greater than the current behavior to evoke change. I've never seen anyone show up at a 12-step meeting and just said, my life's going great. And I was just taking an inventory and noticed that I'm drinking a bit too much. I've never seen that in 21 years. The people that I've seen show up usually say something like this. My entire life is a shit show. I'm about to or have just lost my job. My partner is leaving me, and I likely won't be able to see my kids. For me, I had this moment of clarity and realized that I was recreating the cycle of trauma with my own daughter, and I wasn't willing to do that. It was too painful. Lives are usually ugly when people come to get help, and that's because it has to be so bad that they become willing to give up the one thing that they believe is bringing any relief to be able to manage their deep-seated internal pain. You have to remember that when you're thinking the addict should just go ahead and quit, that what you're really asking that person to do is remove the only tool they have that is soothing the pain within themselves. And for the active addict, That is absolutely terrifying. Number 4, life is going to be rainbows and sunshine as soon as the addict stops using. The reason that someone uses any substance is to bury pain and to soothe themselves in some way. Quitting can definitely help improve circumstances within the home and family dynamics, but typically you start to see what the substance was actually masking. It can range from depression to rage and everything in between. Without the substance to ease the situation, the person can spiral very quickly. That's why some sort of treatment is useful. What you start to see clearly is that using was a symptom of the underlying problems that surface once the person stops. This was my story precisely. I was angry, irritable, agitated, and generally unhappy when I stopped using. It took a lot of therapy and recovery work for me to actually really change and to become a different person. Taking away the substance is simply the very first step in any sort of recovery process. And the last one, addicts are people that live on the streets and have nothing. Addiction doesn't discriminate against socioeconomic backgrounds, class, gender, careers, or anything else. I have sat in recovery meetings with famous people, doctors, teachers, and homeless folks. No one is immune to it. And don't ever assume that someone can't be an addict because they don't present the way you think an addict should look. Friends, I hope that me sharing some of my personal story with you here today shed some understanding on what your loved one may be experiencing. Addiction is brutal and relentless. I hope that you find peace on the journey and that recovery becomes a way of life for the suffering addict. Please reach out to me if you need additional support and I can help point you in the right direction. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with people in your community. Let's change the stigma of addiction together and find solutions and support as more and more people are suffering. Follow me on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram for more tips in between episodes. Until next Thursday, be well.